Michigan breaks an NFL record with 18 invites to the NFL Combine. That spans over 4 classes from 2021 all the way back to 2018 when I was there, a long way. And Drew, some stats for you. How about this? Only one player inside the top 100, that was J.J. McCarthy, 9 top 247 prospects, 9 3-star prospects, including 4 transfers, no 5-stars. And the lowest rated players include Drake Nugent, who came over from Stanford, and Josh Wallace, who came over from UMass. So, Drew, I'll just tee you up here. 18 players, a lot to digest. There's some basic stats for you, but your first impressions of seeing what Michigan has put out coming off the heels of a national championship.
Well, I know this can go both ways, right? Because some of those guys transferred in, but it's really 19 if you include Joe Milton, who got in from Tennessee to the scouting combine, which is just crazy to think about. One word, or actually is this 2 words, player development, Cooper? I mean, we always used to talk about Alabama squeezing the most out of guys, and I think that applies to Michigan. They just get the most out of these individuals. And the one that stands out to me, and I know he's not up here on the screen, but is Jalen Harrell, edge rusher. I think was at Michigan for 4 or 5 years. He's the guy who I saw his spring before his senior season, and guy that I thought was maxed out. I can't recall if we had much verified information on him, but it was like, is this guy going to go on to get drafted one day? And I think it's a lesson for me looking back on it, because he had some traits. Dad played at the next level, and he was a guy that went both ways for a talented Tampa Berkeley prep program. So I think player development is the word for me, Coop. I believe, were you not involved in some of these guys' recruitments, or are we a little dated there?
I was there 2017, so the 2018 class would have been that. Joe Milton, who you mentioned, finished his career at Tennessee. The other guy was Michael Barrett, and I think back to that recruitment, Chris Partridge, who spent this last year with Michigan. Drew, he was always tied in the state of Georgia, and I think about Michael Barrett, and you think about, all right, what stood out? Michael Barrett played quarterback, didn't play a lot of defense, had some snaps on that side of the ball, so there was some evidence to that. But you talk about a guy that just did a little bit of everything. I remember that class so vividly because it was all about, how do we raise the floor of this roster? Because we were missing out on some of the top prospects on our board left and right. I think about guys like Chris Olave, Josh Jobe, go down the list, Amon-Ra St. Brown, JT Daniels, Brian Addison, Julius Ervin ends up at Washington. So it became, okay, now we have this logo. We're one of the most prestigious brands in the country. We can get in any living room. How do we raise the floor of the team? And what I mean by that is players that we know can contribute. They might not be high-level starters in terms of guys that we feel are going to be day 1 or day 2 NFL draft picks. But if you look at Michigan and what they've done, I mentioned 9 top 247 prospects here invited to the NFL Combine. A lot of these guys at the offensive line, Drew, and I think about what they have done at the offensive line. 6 of the 18 coming from the offensive line. Sure, they had a couple transfers as well. But, Drew, I was talking to somebody inside the Michigan program yesterday that said that Ben Herbert, the strength and conditioning coach at Michigan under Jim Harbaugh, who has joined Jim Harbaugh in Los Angeles with the Chargers, was the most important support staff member in all of the country. And in terms of what he brought to that program from an identity, from a toughness standpoint, also the culture as well. You think about these strength conditioning coaches, and a lot of people probably try to get to the bottom of it and say, hey, why do these guys get so well compensated? They spend, and when I say they, the players spend the most time with their strength and conditioning staff more than any other coaches. That is where the true culture and sense of team is developed. So that's a big loss for Sharon Moore that they're going to have to replace. And the other part of that is proof of concept as well. Drew, I think Michigan under Jim Harbaugh has certainly proved themselves as one of the best player development programs in the country. To me, that is not the biggest question mark, but I wonder if Sharon Moore can uphold that standard going forward.
I want to go back to those O linemen, right? So what is it? They got 6 guys in the scouting combine. I think you said that when I was going through our 2024 O line rankings, what stood out to me is I think out of the top 10 players, prospects in the 2024 cycle, with the top 10 shot put markers, I think Michigan had landed pledges from 3 of those guys. And, shot put, why does that matter? It's lower body explosiveness. That was certainly a key indicator when it comes to success and potential. And, you think about it in the trenches, finding leverage, unlocking those hips, moving individuals out of the way. So I guess bottom line, I just don't know if where there's going to be much. I mean, obviously there's going to be a drop off, but it seems like Michigan is reloading with similar players. And I think what we've also talked about, Cooper, I don't know if we've done this on air. Michigan, I think so far, just one guy has asked out of their letter of intent. Other programs, there was a ton of movement after there was a changing of the head coaches. Michigan, to me, it speaks to the culture that not a ton of guys have looked around. Now they still can. I don't think that window's closed, but I think that says a lot about what's going on there in Ann Arbor. That's a tongue twister.
Drew, 6 other programs with 10 or more invites to the NFL Combine. You go down the list: Washington, Florida State, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, and Penn State. How about this? The combined record of these 7 teams, if you include Michigan, who won a national championship, went 15-0, 89-10. I don't have the record of the year before, but some of the teams in that category as well, not 10 or plus. I think Alabama and Georgia were the only 10 plus last year. You go down the list, I think LSU was at 9, Florida was at 9, TCU was also at 9. You take Florida out of that, to me, it was a little bit of an eye-opener, and people might be sitting at home and say, yeah, well, the teams with the most NFL and experienced talent are obviously going to be the teams that you can somewhat predict are going to have some success on the field. This one kind of stood out to me. I mean, there was no team outside of Penn State that had 10 or more players invited to the NFL Combine this year that had 3 losses, right? So you think about that and what that means, and we talk about height, weight, speed, that philosophy all the time, and being able to hit on these guys. I don't know. To me, that was more of an eye-opening takeaway than anything. Like, if you can continue to develop these players at a high level, and we talked about it with Michigan. I mean, 2021 to 2018, right? The COVID year kind of comes into it as well. But if you can continue to stockpile talent, and that's what we talk about, like sustainable, I think a lot of people ask, like, hey, why are you guys so high on Oregon? I expect Oregon, Dan Lanning, that program to be right up here, 9 to 10 players 2 years from now, every year in and year out. And that's kind of what I look at it is, we were having the conversation yesterday, future indicators of success. I think this is a great stat year to year to kind of see, like, this correlates to the top 1% who could potentially win the national championship, but also compete for it as well.
You think Wisconsin and Luke Fickell, you put them in that category as well? All right, we've said that. A pro day in Madison pretty soon is going to be looking good. I remember a few years ago, Luke Fickell at Cincinnati. I think they had 9 guys there. Coop, one other thing that jumped out to me, Florida, just with 2 combine invites. Ricky Pearsall, transfer wide receiver from Arizona State, and then Kingsley Ukajan, interior offensive lineman. You look at their record, okay, just 2 NFL guys there. I think Holy Cross had 2 NFL Combine invites, so that's one that jumped out to me as well.
Jim Nagy brought it up. The director of the Senior Bowl does a phenomenal job. Another great year down there in Mobile. He brought it up, Drew. I think the number is around 4% of FCS, so sub-FBS level invites to the NFL Combine. You compare that to years past, that number's obviously down. He had a tweet out about it, talking about transfer portal effect. I mean, you go to the conference breakdown, SEC 75, Big Ten behind them at 60, Pac-12, rest in peace at 52, Big 12 at 39, the FCS at 14. Drew, any takeaways from the conference breakdown as you see it, or maybe any trends emerging here?
Well, Nagy's referring to those guys transferring up, and I think that's all over the board. I mean, the MAC has just 2 individuals. They lost guys to the Power 5 level. There's some good players in the American that weren't invited as well. I mean, it's just not surprising to me. I think we're only going to see more of this in terms of the 2 conferences out front, the SEC and the Big Ten. We'll see what happens with the media rights and whatnot. But I think this is kind of the lane we're in, what it's going to look like moving forward.
Drew, we've been in it long enough to now, I think, we've recruited a lot of these guys. I've recruited a lot of these guys, depending on where I was at the time. But a lot of these guys now having the opportunity to get drafted, biggest job interview of their life coming up in 2 weeks. You've been in it on the media side long enough and the scouting side. Is there 1 or 2 players that you go down the list of the NFL Combine attendees that you're like, man, I'm excited about this guy because I know he's going to show up in a big way? Maybe that some people aren't talking about, or maybe people are talking about, but you just expect big things from in Indianapolis in a couple weeks.
Well, okay, I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, right? But I saw a lot of people on X, I think you call it X, I still call it Twitter, complaining about Joe Milton getting into the combine, right? Joe Milton over some of these other quarterbacks that were snubs, like Tua's brother, John Rice Plumlee. And Coop, I mean, this is kind of goes back to what we always say about the big franchise projectable frames. He's got a cannon for an arm. I went back and I looked. Joe Milton, Elite 11 regional before his senior year of high school. He was 6'4.5", 222 pounds. This was a guy that played 7-on-7, was running down the field and doing backflips. Evaluators are going to drool over that. And I think you could honestly take the evaluation everyone had of Joe Milton coming out of Olympia High School and apply it to Joe Milton coming out of Tennessee, heading off into the NFL draft. So you compare his 6'4.5" frame to Tua's brother, who was 5'11", and then John Rice Plumlee, who was 6'1". I mean, at the end of the day, the NFL continues to value height, weight, speed. I mean, that is the name of the game. So you want to talk about our rankings process? Yes, we're going to covet and prioritize the big athletic individuals because the guys on Sundays, those decision makers, are doing the same thing.
As somebody who recruited Joe Milton while I was in Michigan, you could have taken Joe Milton out of Olympia High School, as you just alluded to, and put him at the NFL Combine at 17 or 18 years of age, and I think he would have been one of the most physically impressive prospects in attendance. And that's Joe Milton. That's who Joe Milton has always been. And now in terms of the on-the-field product, I think there's a lot to be desired there. I don't know if that guy, to me at this point, the most disappointing thing about Joe Milton, I love Joe Milton, the individual, the most disappointing about, I would say, the lack of development so far at this point in his individual career is that we haven't seen him take that next step. The same guy that you would categorize him coming out of high school in Orlando is really the same prospect that he is today. So he needs some seasoning, obviously, the transfer from Michigan to Tennessee. Andrew, you just never know, right? Just in terms of these guys finding the right fit, having some time to sit at the next level, really develop, get the pressure off their shoulders. Joe Milton made of all the right things as well. I believe won an award down at the Senior Bowl for best teammate as well. So he's got the intangibles. I think physically still needs to come along, and that's the game within the game. He can make every throw on the field. It's not about the arm talent, more about the processing, playing at a faster level as well. So we'll see what happens with Joe Milton. Drew, for me, I mean, this one is low-hanging fruit. How about Rome Odunze, right? I mean, I've talked about this guy multiple times. I think the range on him goes anywhere from as high as number 4 or number 5 in the NFL draft, starting with the Arizona Cardinals, maybe not dropping past Chicago at number 9. But you talk about a guy 6'2.5", hovering around 6'3", big physical receiver, 200 pounds, 10.76 out of Bishop Gorman. I've seen it all. I expect him to really, really impress in Indianapolis, and made me think the other day, man, like these guys are, they've shown it before somewhere. There's not a lot of surprises, right? Like Sauce Gardner was a surprise for us. DJ Turner, you bring up a lot, right? A lot of these guys that make these drastic improvements, like they're the exception of the rule. The Trent McDuffies and the Rome Odunzes and some of these other guys that we've talked about, they've been doing it for a really long time. It would be more of a surprise if they didn't do it at the NFL Combine here in 2 weeks.